Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here in this intimate setting. It's wonderful to see so many friends and also new faces tonight. I'm Nicola Longford, the Executive Director of the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, and we are just thrilled to welcome back to the museum retired United States Secret Service agent Clint Hill and his co-author Lisa McCubbin. Clint and Lisa were here last in Dallas as part of the 50th anniversary commemorative programs in November 2013, after the launch of their New York Times bestseller, Mrs. Kennedy and Me. Their latest book, 5 Presidents, is a fascinating and deeply personal window into the lives and administrations of 5 presidents over a span of 2 decades. This book is riveting, and it's also a touching and beautifully written account of the career and memories of an assistant director of the United States Secret Service, responsible for all protective forces. We often tend to not dwell on what it takes to protect our highest elected leaders at all times and their families, nor do we take time to wonder about the lives of those dedicated to serving in the Secret Service. Tonight, you will surely renew your profound respect for what it takes to serve our country and to reflect upon an era that was rapidly changing from the late 50s through the mid-1970s. Before turning over the floor to our guests this evening, this is a reminder that there will be a short Q&A after the presentation. Please notice the cards that are placed on the seats for you to write your questions. And after the program, for those of you that have not had book signed, we will form another line for book signing. And now it's my deep privilege to salute and to thank our guest speakers this evening, Clint Hill and Lisa McCubbin.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back here at the Sixth Floor Museum. Been here a number of times now, and the staff here does a wonderful job. Tonight we'd like to give you a glimpse into our new book, 5 Presidents, My Extraordinary Journey with Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. The book would not have been written, nor would any of the books that I've been involved with, had it not been for Lisa McCubbin. She was an individual I could trust and have confide in, and had it not been for that fact, I would never have written anything. I had vowed that I would not write a book. But with her assistance, we have managed to write 3 books, and I hope there's not a 4th.
I have your phone number now, though, so watch out. So Clint Hill was born in 1932 in North Dakota in the middle of the Great Depression. He was adopted by this lovely family, Chris and Jenny Hill, who already had another adopted daughter named Janice. And Clint, you grew up in the town of Washburn in this modest home, population 912. How did you go from that beginning to becoming a Secret Service agent?
Well, when I finished high school and went away to college, my interest was in history, and I wanted to become a history teacher and to coach athletics. And that was my intention until I had to enter the U.S. Army. And when I entered the U.S. Army, after basic training, they sent me to the Army Intelligence Center, and they trained me to be a special agent in counterintelligence. And so I did that for a number of years, and when I was through with my Army service, I wanted to do something similar to what I'd been doing. The Secret Service seemed to be a good fit, so I applied and finally was accepted.
So Clint started his career in 1958. He was 26 years old, and within a year, he was assigned to the elite White House detail, really small group of agents, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was president. That's Clint standing in the doorway there on the right. What was it like protecting President Eisenhower?
Well, had his whole life was in the military. He hadn't done hardly anything else but be in the Army, except he had been president of Columbia University. And so we, the agents that were involved with him, he didn't call us by name. He just simply said, "Hey, agent," when he wanted us to do something. But we respected him immensely. He was one of those individuals, if you gave him a schedule and you told him we had to leave by 9:30, at 9:29.30, he was in the car, ready to go. And so from that point of view, it made it easier for us because we knew exactly what to expect. He loved to play golf, and that was one of the very enjoyable times we had. Was we'd be on the golf course flanking President Eisenhower, and I would be carrying a small golf bag to look like I was a golfer. In that golf bag were a couple of beat-up old clubs and a 30 caliber carbine rifle. And so we would walk down the fairway with President Eisenhower.
And when you read Five Presidents, you'll find out that Clint spent a lot of time on the golf course with President Eisenhower. So a month after being on the White House detail, Clint, you got the word that President Eisenhower is going to take an historic trip, and you got to go on that trip with him.
Yes, I was issued a diplomatic passport and made an official representative of the United States government. And we took off from Andrews Air Force Base outside of Washington. Flew directly to Rome. From Rome, we went to Ankara, Turkey. From Ankara, Turkey, down to Karachi, Pakistan. From Karachi up to Kabul, Afghanistan. Kabul down to New Delhi. Went down to Agra to see the Taj Mahal. Back to New Delhi. Flew over to Tehran to see the Shah. Down to Athens. Saw the king in Athens. Got on the USS Des Moines. Went across the Mediterranean over to Tunis, Tunisia. From Tunis, we took the ship back over to Toulon, France. From Toulon, the train to Paris. From Paris, we went down to Madrid to see Generalissimo Franco. And from there to Casablanca. And finally, we came back to Washington, D.C.
Not bad for your first trip abroad.
That was an interesting trip, and I enjoyed it.
And so tell us what it was like protecting President Eisenhower in these countries.
Well, this is a typical photograph of President Eisenhower riding through the streets of Karachi, Pakistan, with the president of Pakistan, Ayub Khan, in a coach drawn by horses. And it was rather precarious considering the fact that it was a very slow-moving coach in a hostile country at times. But at that time, when President Ayub Khan was there, we were considered to be friends of the Pakistanis.
But can you imagine President Obama riding in a carriage in Pakistan?
And this is in Kabul, Afghanistan. We went up to Kabul, and this is President Eisenhower riding with the king in the king's open car. And this is in New Delhi, India. In New Delhi, the president is in the back of the car with President Prasad and Prime Minister Nehru. And the crowds were so thick, as you see here, that at one point, the Prime Minister got out of the car, walked in front of it with his swagger stick, and beat on the people to get them out of the way. And then we went down to see Generalissimo Franco in Madrid, and this is a photograph of that event.
And in 1960, the election between Richard Nixon, who was vice president, and Senator John F. Kennedy. Clint, you were still with President Eisenhower at the time, and Eisenhower hadn't really done much campaigning for Vice President Nixon, but towards the end there, he did appear with him in New York City.
The election was to be held on Tuesday, November 8th, and just slightly before that, President Eisenhower decided to do something, as she says, and the first stop was going to be New York City, but he was going to land at LaGuardia, take a helicopter to Long Island, then helicopter to Westchester County, then helicopter to the Wall Street helipad, and motorcade right up down through what we call the canyons, which is the heart of downtown New York City. And my responsibility was the motorcade. And we timed it so we hit that spot about 11:48 in the morning, which meant that we trapped everybody who was going out to lunch on each side of the street to build a crowd. And that's what they wanted. But if you see this photograph, you see Vice President Nixon standing up waving to the crowd. What you really barely see is on the rear of the car, sitting on the top, that's President Eisenhower. Both men in the same car, open, in the city of New York. It was nerve-wracking.
Tons of confetti, and Clint was responsible for the advance on this motorcade, and all worked out fine. So as we know, John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. What was it like transitioning from Eisenhower to Kennedy?
Well, we went from this 70-year-old grandfather who didn't really like politics or politicking. He didn't like going into crowds or pressing the flesh. He was a wonderful, congenial man, but he wasn't one of the politicians in the area, whereas President Kennedy was. President Kennedy was 43 years old. He had a 3-year-old daughter, a 31-year-old wife, and she was very pregnant. And so beginning in the Kennedy administration, things were very different than they had been during the Eisenhower administration.
But now, so you'd been assigned to President Eisenhower, and you assumed that you were going to be assigned to President Kennedy, but as it turned out, they assigned you to Mrs. Kennedy, and how did you feel about that?
I was devastated. And I mean that sincerely, because I didn't want to be with the First Lady. I knew what the agents went through in previous administrations with Bess Truman and Mamie Eisenhower. They went to fashion shows, and they watched canasta games. And that's as much activity as they had. And so I wanted to be where the action was, and that was with the president.
But as it turned out, you got a different kind of first lady than we had ever seen, and that's Clint there on the right with President and Mrs. Kennedy. And they were so popular just from the moment he took office.
Yes, they were, and she was popular in her own right. When he would go somewhere and there'd be a big crowd, let's say 50,000 people, if she would go with him, the size of the crowd would double. And so it became a problem just to control crowds during the period of that administration.
And you got to spend a lot of time with them up in Hyannisport. I know this is one of your favorite photos of President Kennedy. What was it like being with them in Hyannisport?
Well, we had somewhat of a regular routine. Mrs. Kennedy and the children would go up and spend most of the summer in Hyannisport, and the president would come up on Fridays, and he would fly to Otis Air Force Base in Air Force One, get on a helicopter, and fly over to the Kennedy compound. Now, we would put a golf cart out there near the helipad for him to use, so he'd walk off the helicopter, get in the golf cart, and then he'd yell out, "Anybody for ice cream?" And all of his nieces and nephews would come running. And in this one, John and Caroline are there too, but then he'd take them all to the ice cream store, which was about 2 blocks away, and he'd have to foot the bill.
So some of the happiest memories you have with them is when you saw them together as a family.
That's true, and in this case, we're on Squaw Island and up in the Cape, and they have the dogs with them. They're happy. But you'll notice there in the background is the president. He's on the phone, and that was a constant situation. A president works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Sometimes they say they're on vacation. They really aren't. They're never not available. They're always available. It's either the telephone or a staff meeting or some individual who has a problem. And so it's a constant work problem for a president, no matter who he is.
Now, Clint, you got to be very close with both President and Mrs. Kennedy, and sometimes they asked you to do things that were a little bit outside the normal job description of being a Secret Service agent.
Way outside. We went to Palm Beach for one weekend, and on Friday, we got there, and Mrs. Kennedy indicated to me that she and the president were going to go to a friend's house for dinner. So I had my assistant stay with her. I went to my hotel room, sitting on the bed with my T-shirts and shorts, and the phone rang. It was Mrs. Kennedy. She said, "Oh, Mr. Hill," she said, "the president and I would like to have you do something for us." I said, "Fine, man, what's that?" She said, "Well, you know, Prince Radziwill is here," and that was her brother-in-law, and Chuck Spaulding, and that was his classmate at Choke, and they're going to go on a little hike. And occasionally, the president and I are going to go out and see what they're doing and how everything's going, and we know that the Secret Service is going to have somebody out there, and we think it should be you. I said, "Fine, ma'am." I said, "What time do they want to start?" It was now about 8 o'clock.
And wait, how long was this little hike?
50 miles.
Yeah.
So it was 8 o'clock when she called, and she said, "Well, they want to start about midnight." So I said, "Okay, I'll be right there." And I hung up the phone. I thought, what the heck can I wear for a 50-mile hike? I don't have that kind of shoes or anything. I had a pair of very good Florsheim dress shoes. And so that's what I put on. And that's what you see here walking down the Sunshine Highway in Florida. And then occasionally the president would come out to see what was going on. And in this instance, the two guys decided to have some rest. So the president's standing there. He's the second from the left. And he's giving me a bad time because I allowed them to rest. You see, there was a little wager involved. The president had bet them they could not make 50 miles. And they said they could. So he was telling me that I should get them up, get them. He was trying to wear them out. And so the way we went as soon as possible, but we made the 50 miles. Then
it took about 18 hours. Or
yeah,
18 or...
took us about 18 hours. Yeah. But we made it. No, about 18. And then when it was over, I put them in the car to take them back to Palm Beach, and the driver was driving. I was so worn out, I was ready to get into a shower in a hot bed, and I get back to the house, and the agent said, Clint, the president wants to see you. I thought, oh, not again. But I went in, and they were having a little party. And President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy had made a medal out of construction paper. And so he presented me a medal. The Order of the Pacemaker. It says for Dazzle. And that was my code name. Don't ask me why. February 23, 1963. To he whom the Secret Service will follow through the battle of the Sunshine Highway. Signed, John F. Kennedy.
Okay. And he still has that precious memento. So before we take you to Dallas, we want to show you kind of what it was like for the Secret Service agents who traveled with President Kennedy. And at that time, Clint, there were only about 40 agents on the White House detail at any one time.
Correct. There were roughly 40. 2 of us were with Mrs. Kennedy, 3 with the children, and the remainder were assigned to the president. But that was 3 shifts. And so at any one time, there were only about 5 or 6 agents who actually were around the president. But this is a picture of the president in Ireland. He's traveling through the streets of Dublin, and you can see the crowd there. It was just about overwhelming. This is in Costa Rica, and we had to have the military come out and help us get the crowd away from the motorcade so we could get through. This is in Mexico City. You know, the elevation there is about 9,000 feet or so, or I can't remember for sure, maybe 27,000 something. But that's not snow. That's confetti. The confetti was so deep that by the end of the motorcade, the car was full right to the top of the seats. And this is in Berlin, and it's a massive crowd, and you'll notice there are people on the rooftops and on balconies and windows. And this is where he made the Ich bin ein Berliner speech.
But this was normal, as you saw, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, this was normal at that time. So, Clint, you were on this trip to Texas because you were assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, and she had decided to go on this trip.
That's correct. We left Washington on November 21st on Air Force One. We flew to San Antonio, then to Houston, then to Fort Worth, and stayed overnight. And then we boarded Air Force One again and flew from Carswell Air Force Base to Love Field. Didn't make much sense to most people because we were going to the Trade Mart. We could have driven faster, but instead of that, we drove out to Carswell, took off, flew to Love Field, and then drove through the city of Dallas. We could have probably made it faster in a car, but they wanted a photograph of President and Mrs. Kennedy coming off the rear of Air Force One here in Dallas at Love Field, and that's what they got. That was a political decision. So here they come down the rear stairway of Air Force One. They're going to be received by a reception committee, among whose ranks were Vice President Mrs. Johnson, who they'd just seen 20 minutes before over in Fort Worth. But that's the way things went. The president noticed there was a large crowd behind the fence along the outside of the airport, and so he headed for that crowd, Mrs. Kennedy normally wouldn't do that, but she went right along, shaking hands with all the people there because she wanted to support him. The press were having a field day, as you see, trying to get photographs of President and Mrs. Kennedy.
And so you went through Dallas, and what was the feeling like?
The crowds were large as we drove from Love Field down into Main Street in Dallas. They got larger and larger. By the time we reached Main Street, they were 10, 15 deep on each side of the street, so large that the driver of the presidential vehicle kept the car closer to the left-hand side of the street as opposed to the right-hand side of the street because the president was in the right rear. He was trying to keep the president away from the crowd. That put Mrs. Kennedy right up next to the crowd. So I would get up on the back of the car occasionally to be as close to her as I could. And I knew the president didn't like us up on the back of the car. He had told us that the previous Monday in a motorcade in Tampa. But it was necessary for me to do that in order to have close proximity to Mrs. Kennedy.
But so then at times the crowd would drop off, and so Clint would get back on the follow-up car, and then when it got close again, he did this about 4 or 5 times. And then as you turned, or you got to the end of Main Street, that's when the crowds really started to thin out.
Very much so. As we drove into the area of Dealey Plaza, we were on Houston Street, took a right from Main onto Houston, and then took a left-hand turn onto Elm Street. And it's rather sharp, as you all know, and the big cars, they had to slow way down. We were immediately behind the presidential vehicle, maybe 3 feet separating the 2 cars, and that's me on the forward position of the left-hand side running board. Shortly after we got down on Elm Street, about 150 feet, I was scanning the area to the left on the grassy area and the triple overpass straight ahead of us. And I heard an explosive noise over my right shoulder. It seemed to come from the rear. And so I started to look in that direction. But as I did, my eyes stopped when I got to the back of the car because I saw the president react. He grabbed at his throat like this, and then he started to fall to his left. I knew that it had to have been a gunshot wound, so I jumped, and I ran toward the presidential vehicle. My intention was to get up on top of the back to form a shield there for the occupants of the car. Now, when I jumped off the car and as I was running, they told me later that there was a second shot. I did not hear it. And the reason I didn't hear it was because of the engine noise from the car itself, and immediately to my left was a motorcycle and a motorcycle officer. And so between those 2 noises, I didn't hear that second shot. But as I approached the presidential vehicle, I not only heard it, I felt the third shot because it hit the president in the head. At that time, he was way over to his left and his head was kind of down. So the shot hit him back here, entered back here, but it erupted right out above the right ear. And there was blood and brain matter and bone fragments that just erupted from the wound. They got all over me, all over the car, and all over Mrs. Kennedy. Then, as I approached the car, the driver began to accelerate. So I slipped, and I had to run an extra few steps in order to get up on the car, as you see here. But then Mrs. Kennedy came out on the rear of the car. She was trying to grab some of the material that came off the right rear from the president's head. She did manage to do so. She did have some of the material in her hand. When I put her into the rear seat, the president's body fell to its left with his head in her lap. The right side of his face was up. He had fixed eyes. There was a hole in his skull. I could see that almost all the brain matter in that area was gone. I assumed it was a fatal wound. I turned and gave a thumbs down to the follow-up car crew and yelled at the driver to get us to a hospital.
And you see Clint in this position. He's shielding the occupants. Now, there were 3 shots. He didn't know there were only going to be 3 shots. He assumed, as one would, that more shots were coming. And he was shielding the occupants with his body because that was his job. And that's what he did, reacted so quickly. So as we all know, President Kennedy died at Parkland Hospital, and then, Clint, you were there on Air Force One when the transition took place.
Yes, I was standing just in the doorway behind the two gentlemen you see in the doorway. Mrs. Kennedy stood there in her clothes, still completely covered with blood, to witness the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson as the President of the United States.
And so you stayed with Mrs. Kennedy, of course, for the next several days, constantly, and you were there again for another iconic moment. That's Clint on the left-hand side of the picture in this famous photo of John saluting his father on what was his 3rd birthday.
Two people who came to the funeral, former Presidents Truman and his daughter Margaret, and former President Eisenhower, and they are here extending their condolences to Mrs. Kennedy, who is seated in that car. I am on the left-hand side of the photo.
So, Clint, you were assigned to stay with Mrs. Kennedy for 1 year after the assassination.
Yes, that's correct. And in October of 1964, President Johnson was running for president. Robert Kennedy was running for the Senate seat in New York. President Johnson came to New York to campaign, and Robert Kennedy was campaigning with him in New York. And they came to see Mrs. Kennedy at her residence at 1040 Fifth Avenue. And I was there during this meeting.
And shortly thereafter, then, Clint, you were reassigned, and you were now on President Johnson's detail. And one of the first trips you took was to the LBJ Ranch. First, tell us, what was that transition like, going from Jacqueline Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson?
Well, when I got down to the ranch, and one of the first things that happened was the president noticed me, recognized the fact that I had been with the Kennedys. President Johnson demanded loyalty of anybody who worked with him or for him. And so he put out the order that I should be transferred to some other job because he didn't want me on his detail. The two leaders in the detail went to him and told him that I was a professional, that I'd been with Eisenhower, that I'd been with Kennedy's, I didn't have any political persuasion, and that it was in his best interest that I remain. And so he finally acquiesced, and I stayed there. And this was the beginning of a 4-year period for me with President Johnson.
So that's the house at the LBJ Ranch, and here's more of an aerial shot of the whole thing. Clint, tell us what we're seeing here.
Well, you see there's a jet star there. There's a little parkway in front of the what used to be a hangar, which LBJ made into a theater. And then just above that is some Greens buildings. That's where the White House communications people were, and where the military pilots were stationed, standing by. The White House, right next to that, was the Secret Service command post. And President Johnson acted a little differently than we had anticipated, and much different than what President Kennedy had done. He was an individual who he believed that surprise was his best defense, and so he wanted to do things on the spur of the moment without any notice, generally speaking.
Not even to you.
Not to us, and not to the air crews either. And as you will find out, this is a typical reaction. If you way in the background, you see a golf cart coming. Well, that's the president. The first we realized that something was going to happen was we noticed a valet came out of the back door of the house with a suitcase and a hang-up bag. So we knew the president was going somewhere. We didn't know if it was going to be St. Louis, Austin, or a neighboring ranch. But we had to be ready. So by the time he got out there and we determined which mode of transportation he was going to use, then we figured out where he was going, and everybody was on the radio. I was on the radio to the command post telling him, call St. Louis, tell them we'll be there in 2 hours, get everything ready. And that's the way sometimes we had to operate. It wasn't always that way, but it was that way enough to make it very, very difficult.
And President Johnson loved his ranch so much. He spent so much time at the ranch, which you'll find out when you read the book. And he would just bring people to his ranch.
He brought everyone there. He brought members of the Senate, the House. He brought his cabinet there. He had cabinet meetings there. He brought the Joint Chiefs of Staff there. That's this photo right there. They're sitting out in the front lawn on the wicker chairs discussing the budget and what's going on in Vietnam. Everybody from Curtis LeMay and Earl Wheeler to Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, they're all sitting right there on the front lawn of the LBJ Ranch.
On those flimsy folding chairs we all used to have in our backyards. So, Clint, then you were with President Johnson now when he's being inaugurated in January of 1965.
Correct, and during the inaugural parade, we had the Secret Service car to transport the now President Johnson. That's myself on the rear, as you see the photograph there. Oh, by the way, that car is the same car that was here in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. It's the same car that President Kennedy was assassinated in. After the assassination, it was returned to Ford Motor Company and Hess and Eisenhower, and they completely refabricated it. They enclosed it completely, put some armor on it and some armored glass, painted it black, and we used that car from that point on as a presidential vehicle.
But now, even though this car was now armored, President Johnson found ways to be among the people.
Yes, here it is. I'm standing up in the follow-up car, as you see there, observing what's going on. President Johnson has just stopped the motorcade, and now he has exited the car because he wants to say hello to the people, which is fine, I guess, but it was rather dangerous because we had no idea who was in that crowd or what was going on. And that was another typical thing that he loved to do.
So President Johnson has sort of become synonymous with the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War was going on throughout his administration. Tell us what that was like, what the feeling was like.
Well, there were constant demonstrations in Washington outside the White House. This is on the north sidewalk. This one is on the south sidewalk at Lafayette Park across the street. And if you're in the White House, and this is at the reflecting pool next to the Lincoln Memorial, you see the Washington Monument in the background. But it was one of those situations where if you were in the White House, you could hear the demonstrators across the street chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today?" And that type of thing. So it really wasn't very pleasant.
And it really started to eat at him over time.
It did over a period of time. It really bothered him a great deal. And it made it more difficult to take him anywhere, whether it was a speech site or anything else, because they always showed up.
Now, by the end of 1967, Clint, you were made the agent in charge of presidential protection for Johnson. He had come to trust you.
Yes. And this is a photograph on Air Force One where he is talking to us. I'm sitting there facing him. I'm the third one from the right. And but he always had something to say. He always talked to us a lot and gave us all a bad time.
And tell us about one of the first trips that you happened to take that ended up taking you around the world at the end of 1967.
Well, his friend, Prime Minister Holt from Australia, had drowned. And so he went there to attend his funeral. And since we were halfway around the world, LBJ thought it'd be a good idea to keep going. He didn't tell anybody, though. That was the problem. He finally revealed it to the pilot. I mean, it was rather important that he know. And then we got some information from the pilot that what he planned to do. And so we had agents on all kinds of different airplanes flying the opposite direction we thought we were going to go, which was back to the United States. We went toward Southeast Asia. And we flew from Canberra, Australia, across Australia, and it ended up in Korat, Thailand, where there was a large United States Air Force base. They were flying fighter jets, bomber runs out of Korat. We got there in the middle of the night, and he wanted to address and talk to the pilots. And then the next day, we flew down to Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam. And that's what this is right here. He's talking to the troops in Vietnam at Cam Ranh Bay. It was somewhat spontaneous on his part. The troops were not aware until the last minute that we were coming.
And so you kept on going, and it was just about Christmas Eve.
It was. Now we went from Karachi to Pakistan, stopped and saw Ayub Khan, and then flew to Rome where he saw the president of Italy and the Pope, and then he took off. We were coming back to the United States. But we had to land and refuel. And so it's now Christmas Eve, and we're going to land in the Azores and refuel. So Johnson's on the plane, and he decides to go to bed, puts on his pajamas, goes into the state bedroom, goes to sleep. The pilot arranges for the commander at the Azores refueling stop to keep the PX open so the people on the plane can do some Christmas shopping, because none of us had a chance to do any. And so we land, and everybody's going to go to the PX. I told them all to go. I'd stay with the president. So they all took off, went to the PX. I'm standing at the foot of the ramp, walking around. Middle of the night, all of a sudden I hear, "Hey, Clint, where is everybody?" I said, "They've all gone to the PX, Mr. President. You know, it's Christmas Eve, and they all want to do some Christmas shopping." She said, "Oh, hell, I haven't done any Christmas shopping." I said, "Let's go." Now he's in his pajamas. So he reaches in the closet, puts on a trench coat. Down the ramp he comes. I commandeered an Air Force car and a driver, and I said, "Take us to the PX." And we went to the PX. We got in that PX, and the locals who were running the place, they couldn't believe the commander-in-chief was Christmas shopping in his pajamas. But he was.
And you were right there with him. So now we go to 1968, which was quite a year. And what did you think when President Johnson made this announcement on March 31st of 1968?
Well, I knew he was going to address the nation that night, and I knew he was going to stay in the White House, so I went home. And I was sitting there listening to TV like everybody else. And when he got to the last line of his speech, and he said, "And I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president," I almost fell off my chair. Because as powerful a man as he had been, he was a career politician. I never thought he'd give up the presidency. I thought for sure he would run again in '68. So I was shocked like everybody else.
And then 4 days later, another shock.
4 days later, I was in my office underneath the cabinet room, and all of a sudden we got word that Martin Luther King had been shot. And so the president was notified, and this is a photo in the Oval Office. See the president's on the phone talking to J. Edgar Hoover, trying to find out what information they had. Some of his staff is there, including his secretary, Marie Famer, and the other people are looking at the three TV channels that were available at the time. He had this special setup fixed for the Oval Office so he could always monitor whatever the TV networks were saying about news.
And so then that night, in the middle of the night, you had a phone right next to your bed that connected directly to the White House, and you got a call in the middle of the night.
About 2:30 in the morning, my phone rang. It was a direct call from him. He said, "Clint," he said, "you know, tomorrow morning we're going to the National Cathedral for services for Martin Luther King." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I want to make sure a couple of things." He said, "I want to make sure the car that we go in gets as close to the doorway as you can." And he says, "I want you as close to me as white on rice all the way through this ceremony." I said, "Don't worry, Mr. President, I'll be there." And I was, and this is a photo of coming out. That's me right behind him. I was as close as white on rice.
And the death of Martin Luther King caused riots and fires all around the nation, and you were up with President Johnson in a helicopter as he toured Washington and saw the damage that had been done was still going on. And then just a couple months later, yet another shocking tragedy.
Yes, we got word that Bobby was in Los Angeles. He had just won the California primary, and he made a speech at the Ambassador Hotel in L.A., and as he exited through the kitchen, he was shot. And we got word shortly after it happened. And during the night then, there was kind of everybody's walking on eggshells because they weren't so sure of his condition. but it proved that he didn't live. And so immediately, President Johnson put out a directive that all presidential candidates, every one of them, would be given Secret Service protection. So out of just at a few hours' notice, we were required to protect everybody that was running for president in 1968.
And prior to that, the Secret Service did not protect presidential candidates, so that's when it started.
And this is a signing of the legislation requiring that that be done.
And so then now, Clint, you were with President Johnson and with him when he attended the funeral of Robert Kennedy.
Yes, we went to New York first to the funeral services in St. Patrick's Cathedral. Then President Johnson returned to Washington, awaiting the arrival of Bobby Kennedy's casket at Union Station. They were bringing him back to Washington by train. And so President and Mrs. Johnson went to Union Station, and I accompanied them there and met the train as it came on. And that was the last time I ever saw or talked with Jacqueline Kennedy. I saw her. I extended my condolences to her for what had happened. And that was the last time I ever had an opportunity to talk with her.
So 1968 is a presidential election, and Richard Nixon gets the Republican nominee. And right after the Republican convention, President Johnson invited Nixon and his staff to the LBJ Ranch, and that's what we're seeing here.
Yes, and that's a little luncheon there. On the left, Spiro Agnew, Dick Helms, the CIA director, Ron Ziegler. Down there's the president's at the end. Then there's Nixon between Ziegler and Johnson. Then there's Bob Haldeman and members of Johnson's staff, Jim Jones and
they all look like they're having a great time.
Well, Johnson had just told them a joke, and that's they were having a good time, as a matter of fact. But then he took Nixon aside, and he took him out on the front portion of the LBJ Ranch House and had a little one-on-one conversation with him.
Now, I want you to notice what President Johnson is wearing. This is what he called his ranch clothes, and he had this sort of ranch uniform that he wore all the time. And Clint, it just so happened on this same day, after everyone left, you got a package.
I received a package, and I opened it, and it turned out to be a set of ranch clothes identical to those, except they were long-sleeved. And they were a gift from President Johnson. Then I received a phone call from President Johnson. He said, "Did you get the package I sent you?" I said, "Yes, Mr. President." I said, "Thank you very much." He said, "Hey, I want you to put them on. Come out here, show me if they fit." So I was in the command post. I put on the ranch clothes, and I received, you have no idea what it went through with the rest of the agents.
A little ribbing.
I went out to the pool in those ranch clothes. They're very nice, very, very well made, wonderful material, and he approved it. That's the last time I ever had them on.
So then Richard Nixon is elected president in 1968, and once again the transition happens, and you were not assigned to the president, even though you were the agent in charge of presidential protection. What was the reason for that?
Well, I had been with both Kennedy and then with Johnson. And everybody knew that Nixon disliked both of them intensely. So the thought process was that I would be a constant reminder, and it would not be in the Secret Service's best interest if I were with Nixon. So they made me the special agent in charge of vice presidential protection in 1969. So here I am with Spiro and Judy Agnew as they're coming to the White House on Inauguration Day to have coffee with the Johnsons.
And here you are when President Nixon Richard Nixon is taking the oath of office. And I don't know if you can see Clint up there in the top left corner on the aisle, witnessing yet another historic event. And then yet again, you were there for the inaugural parade.
And this is the inaugural parade in 1969, and that happens to be SS 100X, the same car that was here in Dallas in 1963, the same car that was used in 1965, and the same, now this car is used in 1969 for Vice President Agnew, and I'm in the right front seat.
So being with Vice President Agnew, though, you got to do some things that were kind of fun. It was a little bit less pressure for about a year for you.
A lot less pressure, a lot more fun. Here I am watching the moon, the space shuttle or spaceship going to the moon.
Apollo 11.
Apollo 11, and I'm standing right behind Spiro Agnew. That's former President now Johnson next to him, and Mrs. Lady Bird Johnson on the left. And it was a spectacle to see and to feel and to hear when that rocket took off. The ground shook. It was amazing to watch.
So now President Nixon, he had some similar habits to the others.
He wanted to press the flesh. He wanted to be among the people and wanted them to see him. And so the car didn't have an open top, so he crawled up on top of the car. And this is what you see.
And still there were protests going on around Vietnam. That was a constant problem for you. And then on June 17th, 1972, you got another one of those middle-of-the-night phone calls.
Yeah, that phone line really got worked out every night. Yeah, I got a phone call from the command center. The intelligence agent called me to say there'd been a burglary at the Watergate. Somebody had broken into Larry O'Brien's office. He was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. And they had made 5 arrests. I said, oh, great, I'm glad they got arrested somebody, but what's that got to do with the Secret Service? I said, well, he said, it turns out that one of the 5 people had some identification on him that indicated he was associated with CREEP. Now, CREEP meant the Committee to Re-elect the President. And that meant that he was working on behalf of the White House staff on this special group. And that meant that what they did, for all intents and purposes, came right out of the White House somehow. We didn't know for sure how, but we knew there had to be a White House affiliation.
And so the Washington Post reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, as you know, followed this, and an investigation ensued. And there was a very important piece that came out about a secret recording system in the Oval Office. Now, did you know about that recording system?
Yes, I knew about it shortly after it was installed. They told me exactly what it was. I wasn't surprised initially that they had been asked to install a recording system because President Johnson had taped many of things, and so had President Kennedy. But what surprised me was the type of equipment they required. It was voice activated, which meant that any of the rooms in which we had placed these listening devices, they began recording automatically when anybody entered that room and started to talk. Now, nobody knew about it except the president, his presidential assistant, Alex Butterfield, and the agents who installed it. It was very closely held. So people like Henry Kissinger, who oftentimes was in that office talking to the president, never had any idea he was being tape recorded. And it wasn't only the Oval Office. It was a cabinet room. It was a private office the president had in the executive office building and some other places as well.
And so this investigation goes on, and then there's an investigation into Vice President Agnew. He ends up resigning, which was a shock to you. And then we have the eventual resignation of Richard Nixon, and you were there for all of this. What was the mood like in the White House at that time?
Well, after the resignation or the indication from Nixon that he was going to resign, it was, everybody was crying and sobbing, and all these people that were so loyal to him and had worked for him for so long, they were very disappointed that he would resign. And so then on August 9th, he left the White House around 10:09 a.m. He walked out on the South grounds with his wife, Pat, accompanied by then Vice President and Mrs. Ford. In the background, you see the 2 Nixon daughters, Tricia and Julie, with their husbands. and the staff was there on the south grounds. And Nixon walked up to the helicopter, threw his arms skyward in a V for victory sign, and I said to myself, I don't know what he's celebrating, but he seems to be happy. And everybody else that was there was light applause, but most of it was tears and sobs. And so I never could understand his desire to do this type of thing, but as though he was going to, he was winning something, and I'm not sure what he won.
And so then you were there for the swearing in of Gerald Ford in the East Room of the White House, another very unusual transition, and you were one of the few people in that room, and were with Ford then until July of 1975 when you retired. Now, Clint, why did you end up retiring from the Secret Service?
In 1975, when I went for my annual physical exam, which was required of us every year, we had a very thorough exam. I was being examined by doctors at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And when it was over, I was waiting for the results. And one of the doctors was actually a personal friend of mine, Dr. Merlin Voss, who had been the doctor assigned to Vice President Agnew and was also assigned to President Johnson. And he came to me and said, Clint, he said, I don't know how to tell you this, but you didn't pass your physical. I was shocked. I knew I was having problems because I started having problems in 1970 when they gave me a desk job and I had too much time to think. And the thing that I thought about was Dallas, what had happened here, how could we have prevented it? Oh, and I had that sense of guilt and failure. And so it just ate me up, and over a period of time, that affected my physical well-being, and I just couldn't pass my physical.
And so you retired, and I know you had a tough time for many, many years after that. Took you a long time to heal. You went through some bad periods. Eventually, you came back to Dallas. You started to make peace with it. And when I met you in 2009, what astonished me, Clint told me that he had never talked to anybody about the assassination. It was 2009, and the assassination was 1963. Slowly, he started opening up to me, and he swore he would never write a book. Well, 3 books later, we are so glad that you decided to share your memories. And I know when you were growing up in Washburn, North Dakota, you wanted to be a history teacher. Well, you've become a fantastic history teacher. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we're going to take some questions.
We have some questions there.
Some questions that
written on cards.
They're collecting questions, if you have any. There are some, okay. We're not going to get through all of these, so here's an easy one. Karen wants to know, she grew up Lutheran. She's wondering if you still are a Lutheran.
Well, I was born that way, I guess. I don't know. Yes.
She's going to send you a T-shirt that says, "Kiss me, I'm Lutheran." Okay.
I'll wear it.
What is your most vivid memory of Fort Worth, the morning of November 22nd?
Well, that morning we were in Fort Worth, and there was going to be a breakfast at which President Kennedy was supposed to attend and speak, and Mrs. Kennedy had indicated on her written schedule that she wasn't going to go. But once the president got in there were so many people that wanted to see Mrs. Kennedy that he had the agent down there that was with him call me upstairs and tell me, bring Mrs. Kennedy down here right now, which I did. So, and when we walked into the room just exploded in applause. They were so happy to see her.
After the assassination in Dallas, how did you help train or share your experience with other Secret Service agents or trainees for future administrations?
Well, one of the things they did was they ran the Zapruder film in training school for the younger agents, and they required me to be there to explain exactly what was going on, hoping that the agents would understand exactly what transpired, and it gives them an idea what they could face out in the future.
How does it make you feel when you see the events of 11/22/63 fictionalized in popular films like In the Line of Fire or TV shows like 11/22/63 and I might add JFK?
I don't like to see it fictionalized. It's one of those events that shouldn't be done in that manner, in my opinion. If they want to see what happened, they have the real thing. They look at the Zapruder film.
What does it feel like for you to be back here in Dallas?
Well, it's always somewhat emotional. Initially, it was very difficult. First time I came back was in 1990. And at that time, I walked the area of Dealey Plaza, came up into this building to the 6th floor. It had just started, I believe, as a museum at that time. And so I didn't even sign my real name when they had to sign in. I signed a fake name because I didn't want anybody to know who I was. But it was emotional, and now I've been back here so many times since then that it's gotten to the point where I can do it with any real emotion.
Based on your experience on the ground, do you believe any shots were fired from the grassy knoll?
Well, there were only 3 shots fired, and they all came from the 6th floor window here in the Texas School Book Depository, so there were no shots from the grassy knoll.
Did you have any dealings with RFK, and if so, how did he compare to JFK?
I had a lot of dealings with RFK. Very different than his brother. Very quick to anger. Had a temper. And usually wanted everything his own way. He was much more difficult to deal with than John F. Kennedy.
It takes an extraordinary person to dedicate their life to a protectee they may not respect or even like. What goes through the mind of a Secret Service agent who works for an abusive president or first lady? How far does the dedication to their protection go? Why do agents put up with any personal abuse?
Well, I don't know if there's really personal abuse toward an agent. There may be, but I doubt it. The reason that we put up with anything we don't like is that we're there protecting the office of the president and its occupant. We don't care who he is, if he's a Democrat, a Republican, or he's an independent. It doesn't matter. And it wouldn't matter if he was male or female, to be honest with you. We would just do the job in the same manner. It's the occupant of the office. It doesn't have anything to do with politics.
To future generations, what would you want them to remember about each of the presidents you served?
Well, I don't know well, I say that all of them, and really I think, had the best interests of the country at heart when they were president. I think they did their best in many instances. And things don't always go the way they want them to. They didn't go the way Johnson wanted it to regarding Vietnam, and it didn't go the way Nixon expected it to about Vietnam. When Nixon withdrew the troops, which is wonderful, then he started increasing the bombing. And that ended up with all the students in the United States who were just angered, and we ended up with 4 students killed in Kent State, and the demonstration just got worse and worse. And so oftentimes the president will mean well, but what he tries to do just doesn't work.
How does a Secret Service agent on the president's detail have a private life or family? And is this different now?
I think it's somewhat improved now over what it was in my day. When I came into the organization, there were only 269 agents in the entire Secret Service. 40 of us were at the White House. Now there are around 3,500 in this organization. There are many more available at the White House. They have changed the shift alignment so that the agents do get more time off. They get a period of time for training, and so they do have an opportunity to spend more time with their families. However, I will say this, that the Secret Service has tried to increase its size periodically, and Congress has always denied them that opportunity, and so they've always worked shorthanded. And so right now, they're involved in the campaign, and the agents aren't spending much time at home at all. And it really is difficult for the organizations to retain good people under those circumstances.
Okay, I think we've got through almost all these. I've got just a couple more. What is the funniest thing you heard one of the presidents say? And can you repeat it?
No, I probably can't. Not in polite society, no.
So you overhear a lot of things and don't write about all of them.
We do. We overhear a great many things. We know what's going on. But be rest assured, we give them their privacy. When they're in residence, like at the White House, the second floor, that's off limits. We don't go up there unless we absolutely have to. That is where they can be themselves with their own family, enjoy their life. When they're in a private residence somewhere, we secure the residence. The internal side of that house, that's their place to do whatever they want to do.
Do you think it is harder to protect the president now with the terrorist threats like suicide bombers?
Much more difficult today than it was when I was an agent. The challenges are much greater, much more severe. It's a terrible job to worry constantly about things like ISIS and ISIL, but that's what they do, and they do it pretty well.
I think I've read most of these. Did Jackie have to ask for you to come to Dallas? Were you assigned to a different detail before the trip?
No, I became assigned to Mrs. Kennedy on November 11th, 1960, 3 days after the election in 1960. And I was with her constantly from that point on. And so when she told me that she had decided to come to Dallas on this trip to Texas because she wanted to help the president in his reelection bid, I just automatically came with her.
So I think we'll end with this one. Do you think the truth will ever come out?
About what?
That's a good question.
The truth about what happened here in Dealey Plaza and on Elm Street is out. Lee Harvey Oswald, a loner, acting alone, fired 3 shots from the 6th floor window, 1 floor down from that window in there, at the motorcade, and he hit President Kennedy twice and Governor Connolly once. It was fatal to President Kennedy, and it was seriously injured Governor Connolly. There were no other shots fired. Case closed.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.